Welcome, everybody. This is Still a Part of Us. It's a place where moms and dads get to talk about their kids that have died either in stillbirth or in infant loss. So we are so grateful to be back here with Miranda. She told the story of her son, George, and we're going to talk to her a little bit more today about some things that she's experienced as she has grieved his loss. And once again, I am Winter, and I want to just do a really quick warning of that we're going to be talking about stillbirth today, and it is full of triggers. So please just be healthy and be safe. So if you need to not listen to this episode, please do not listen to this episode. We just want everybody to be safe. And if you are joining us as a lost mom or a lost dad, welcome. We're sorry that you're part of this club that nobody wants to be a part of. If you feel the desire to subscribe to help others find other stories, and hit the subscribe button, and we can help each other out and support each other. So Miranda, thank you again so much for coming on today. I really enjoyed hearing about George and your experience in the UK as having lost him about 10 months ago, 11 months ago, right? At the time of
Yes,
this
that's right.
recording. So,
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It's been good to talk about him.
yeah, good. I'm glad. And just for a little bit of context, so it was about 11 months ago. What happened to George? How far along were you when he passed away?
Yeah, so I found out that George had no heartbeat when I was 39 weeks and 1 day pregnant. So we were ready to meet him. We were in the home stretch. It was my very first day of maternity leave when we got the devastating news that his heart had just unexpectedly stopped.
Yeah. Please go listen to the birth episode of George, because I just can think of all these terrible things that were I mean, all of these terrible things that happened to Miranda, but it was also compounded with the COVID pandemic and all of those wonderful things that come along with it, right? It's worth a listen. So if you can jump over there, please do. So Miranda, I know that you mentioned before in your other episode that after George passed away, you and your husband Graham basically escaped a little bit. You guys didn't go back to your flat in the UK, in London, and you just ended up you stayed in a hotel for a few days, and then you were in Edinburgh for a couple months, and you made a point to say that Graham basically took care of you.
That's true. I sometimes joke that, I became the infant. I was waking up at night crying. I needed to be fed my breakfast and, told when to when to have a nap, It was,
Yeah.
I was afraid of the dark. I really, turned a bit, childlike myself, and he really did take care of me. I wouldn't have got out of bed. I wouldn't have fed myself properly. I don't know how long it would have been until I did, but he really, I mean, he saved me in a way. Not only did he make sure I took care of myself, but he did things and arranged things to make sure that we were taking care of our mental health. And I think escaping was perhaps one of the best things we did. Although it was lonely, there was a certain comfort in being anonymous where we were.
Mhm.
And one of the things that we did, I don't know if anyone who's listening has been to Scotland or to Edinburgh, but it was summertime, so arguably the best time to be there. And we just did beautiful walks in nature. We climbed mountains. As my physical recovery started getting better, we picked big mountains to climb. Full day hikes. And I think when everything else in your life feels like a complete failure, there was something really uplifting about doing something that felt like an accomplishment.
Yeah.
And honestly, if it wasn't for Graham finding those mountains to climb, finding the directions, driving us there, planning it all. There's no way I would have done any of it. And honestly, I owe him such gratitude for just not giving up on me during that time. He was he was the only thing that kept me going.
Yeah, it's amazing, like, especially those it's so the pain is so acute in those early days, and you really don't know how to function. Yeah, I remember thinking, like, I was pretty proud of myself when we got out of bed and had something nutritious to eat, like, in the morning,
I
so
mean, it really does feel like a big accomplishment.
yeah.
Yeah, simply having a shower. I mean, blow drying my hair, putting on actual clothes. I really felt like, wow, really an accomplished person. And when you step back and think of about what I was doing, prior to George's death, it was comical. What suddenly felt like a big deal in my life, but it was baby steps to rebuild, just tiny, tiny steps.
Yeah. I really because you do feel there's just that yeah, that first bit of grief is just so intense and it just yeah, it just takes over everything, so and then how, you guys came back after those 2 months, you came back from Edinburgh. What was that transition going back to your flat? Did you had an entire nursery all put up. What did you guys do about that?
That was hard. It was because I knew it was there. It was sort
Yeah.
of this lurking thing that we had to deal with on our return. We had very kind friends that asked if we wanted them to pack everything up for us while we were
Mm,
gone and
mhm.
take it away. And I think it was really nice of them to offer, but it was something I really wanted to do myself. I felt quite passionate that I wanted to put away his things the way I wanted to put them
Mm,
away.
mhm.
Even though he had never seen them or interacted with any of the things, they were very much in my mind George's things.
Yeah,
I remember very early we entertained selling some of them, and I just thought absolutely not. If
right.
George didn't get to use these, no one will.
Yeah.
And so I decided, we would get a nearby storage room, and I would pack everything up in neat, tidy, labeled boxes, and we'd bring them to this nearby storage room where I could visit his things when I wanted, which I continue to do to this day. And I don't know, sort of ceremoniously after his funeral, I just put everything away. I think I was really adamant that I didn't want the door to his room to just be permanently shut and be this sort of awful place that no one ever went in anymore.
Mm, mhm.
It was really important to me to turn his room into some like a nice space where we'd want to go. So I kind of tore apart our living room and that room, and I rearranged all the furniture, and I turned it into this sort of, I don't know, I called it a bit of a sanctuary. I put a bookshelf and loads
Mm.
of plants and a little desk where my computer is now, and I spend a great deal of time in that room. There's a little area on top of a dresser where his ashes are, and some of his things that I think are quite special. And I don't know, it just sort of feels like I'm there with him. I bought this beautiful light that's like a kind of like a bonsai tree with sort of pearlescent bulbs on the end, and I turn
Mm.
it on at night because I don't like that the room is dark at night. I
Oh,
like there to be a bit of ambient light in there. It just feels like there's a presence in there, and so it probably all sounds a bit unnecessary, but it makes that room feel very sort of alive and special, and not this kind of terrible tomb that we just shut away forever.
yeah, no, I think that's actually a great idea to because, yeah, it could feel very, so sad, and it sounds like you're trying to give it a little bit of a different take, reframing of what that room is. It sounds like is it your home office kind of also, where you work from
It is
home?
now, yeah.
Yeah, so
It is. Yeah, so I spend a great deal of time in there. His memory box is there. It sort of
mhm,
sits behind me on all my calls, and it sort of feels like I can be there with him. I know people might find that hard to imagine, but I don't know. It makes me feel close to him, and I can think of him while I'm in there, and just feel like his presence is there somehow.
yeah. It sounds very, like a calming place,
It
um,
is. It is.
for you. And as you've gotten a little bit farther out, how are those days looking like? Because I think by then you were maybe how long was your maternity leave? Like how long were you able to take off?
I'm still on maternity leave.
Oh, awesome.
So
Yay. Okay.
yeah, so it's yes, unlike the United States, we very kindly get a year as a maximum, so you can
Oh.
take a year off. I think there was some conversation with my employer that
Mhm.
maybe I'd like to come back sooner, obviously, but I think it was working in the world of PR, which is in client service. I just simply don't have the energy or the enthusiasm for that kind of work right now, and I think I hold myself to very high standards professionally, and I know that I can't be reliable, and I wouldn't do that to clients or
Right.
to my team. So we've worked out a different arrangement where I'm now the editor of a fitness website, which is much more part time in terms of hours, and it's
Yeah.
something I do on my own terms, on my own time. And if I need to disappear for a day because it's a bad day,
Mhm.
I'm not letting anyone down. And I think that works really well for me right now because I think while I'm worlds away from where I was last June, there are still good days and bad days.
Yeah.
And I think if I was having one of those bad days and we had, a client that needed something, there is a 0% chance I could be there for them. And I think for that reason, I'm still sort of hanging on to this mat leave for as long as I can.
Yeah, you might as well. I mean, like, if you have the opportunity, that's great. Was that easy to, I guess being at home obviously you guys were home because of COVID, and then also being on maternity leave. Did that give you well, I'm not saying the luxury, but did that give you the time to process everything that had happened? Because this is the one thing that I've learned is that stillbirth is like it's like this big huge shock because you're like everything's going great and then everything is not going great and then you have to do all of these things and it's just a whirlwind of things that are just sad and terrible and horrible and then all of a sudden you stop and you're done and you're like what just happened and you I always felt like I was in shock. So I'm wondering, was that time good to sit and think and how have you gone about trying to process that grief and what happened?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and I'm really grateful for being able to have this time. I think at first it was really difficult because I'm quite a high energy
Mhm.
person. My job was a huge part of my life. Fitness and running was a big part of my life. I wrote a blog. I scarcely had any free time. I was always on the move doing something. Generally, I don't deal with aimlessness very well, and so to have just shut off everything in my life that contributed to my identity was massively shocking, and it just completely rocks your sense of self, and it took me months to try to rebuild. The only thing I could think to do was to basically make self-care my new full-time job. So I was broken and I needed to fix myself. And so I needed to do everything I could to get myself in the best shape I could mentally and physically.
Mhm.
And so I had the time. And so I do things like, meditate. I might have squeezed in like a 10-minute morning meditation in the past. I can spend 1 hour doing a deep meditation now. I read books voraciously. I indulged in old hobbies that I'd long forgotten. Uh, I went on long walks. Anything I could that just felt like it was good and soothing for the soul, and sort of was able to do it unapologetically
Mhm.
because there was nobody demanding my time anymore. It took me a long time to stop feeling like I was wasting my time,
Yeah.
and started reframing that as this is this is what I need to do to get better. And I guess on top of that, also working with a therapist as well has been helpful. I think started working with a trauma therapist pretty much the week after George died, and I think that was extremely helpful. I know that therapy is not for everyone, but I think in managing extreme grief and shock, having an expert in your corner, at least for me, was extremely helpful.
Yeah.
I often maintain that everyone should have a therapist, regardless of whether you think you have problems or
I
not.
know, I was like, "Me
Um,
too."
I mean, I think it's just from a self development perspective, I think is really helpful. But in the course of dealing with trauma, I think has been particularly useful. So, being able to schedule those calls, in the middle of the afternoon without worrying about work obligations, I think has also been really helpful in terms of my recovery.
Yeah. And you have a trauma therapist. That's very I everybody always just, has a counselor or a therapist and this person actually specializes in trauma. That's so
Yes.
interesting. Is there anything that has been pivotal or kind of aha moment type things that your therapist has brought up or helped you with?
Yeah, so I think also a good question. So I think there's lots of different types of therapy out there,
Mhm.
and I would encourage people to do research if they are looking for a therapist. I think the most common type is CBT, so cognitive behavioral
Mhm.
therapy, which is just sort of a talking therapy, very useful. What my trauma therapist does specifically is a technique called EMDR,
Oh,
which
yes. Uh-huh.
you may have heard of.
Mhm.
Yeah, which sounds completely wonky. It's basically rapid eye movements while you recount traumatic experiences. Even saying that, it sounds truly awful. I'm not going to pretend that it's not painful. We usually start the sessions by, talking about what the most painful memory is and sort of getting stuck in with that. And it's hard. It's hard work, but I think perhaps like many people, I was extremely skeptical at first. I just thought this is completely bonkers. Like, how can this work? And especially, how can it work through Zoom,
Right.
or through a video conference? Is it even going to be effective through a screen?
Mhm.
And it's one of those things where scientifically, even though there's enough research to show that it works, scientists aren't really in agreement about why it works,
Oh.
which is interesting to me. There's theories around, it has to do with the way that the mind processes information, similar to rapid eye movement in
Mhm.
sleep. But as far as this kind of therapy goes, it's a bit inconclusive as to why it works. All they know is that it does work. So I thought, I mean, I'll give it a try. If
Yeah.
it's completely nonsense, then I will try something else.
Mhm.
And I think after the very first session I had, we processed George's, basically his death and then birth. And it was basically the most exhausting hour, second to the actual event itself in terms of it being traumatic. I was so tired after. I remember I slept for like 3 hours after the call. But then the next day, we were speaking to a bereavement doula, another
Mhm. Mhm.
person in my support network, and she asked me to describe what had happened. And this was many weeks following George's death. And I remember it was the first time that I was able to talk about what had happened without just being a blubbering mess. I didn't cry. I could talk about it without sort of almost with a bit of space from it. It was obviously
Mhm.
still very sad, very emotional, but it was like there was just a bit of space between the event and how I felt. And I remember thinking straight away, like, that's really interesting. That to me seems like a direct result of the therapy we just did.
Yeah.
And I think I've seen that trend over and over again as we've worked together, where things that feel really intensely emotional, whether it's, grief or sadness or anger, they're just so debilitating almost in their intensity after our sessions. It's that feeling is still there, but it's not quite as explosive or all consuming that
Right.
I can sort of engage with it if I want to
Right.
or not. I sometimes describe it as it's like as if it's in a glass box and I can see it and say sort of hello there anger, and shut the door if I want, but I can also open it and go be with it if I want to, and it's a really difficult thing to explain, I think.
Mhm.
But if you're open to it and you have the option to have a therapist who practices EMDR, I would highly recommend it if for people who have suffered the shock of stillbirth for sure.
My husband Lee actually has done EMDR off of another friend who had recommended it when she had experienced quite a traumatic experience in her life, and he has found it extremely helpful as well. So I I will second your recommendation there because
Great. Well, I'm glad I don't sound like a
nope.
crazy person
It
then
was
who got.
he came back and he's like, "I am so tired." I remember him specifically,
Yeah,
and he would just like, "I'm exhausted," because you just repeat things over and over again just to kinda that's how he explained it to me, and so it was interesting, but he felt like it was extremely it was very good for him. So, yes, so I second that
good.
recommendation. Did you it sounds like you have a great little team that has helped you through all of this. No, seriously, like and I was like, I don't think people realize that they need to kind of create a team to get past these such a traumatic event, I think. And so, it sounds like you have a bereavement doula, you have your therapist, any other people that have that seem to be a part of your quote unquote team, and because I would
Yeah.
encourage people to create a team like that. I think that is a great way to put it, is like, you need help to get out of this where you're at right now, and you need
I
people.
would agree 100%. I know, I mean, even in the earliest days, if you had told me, go find different elements of support, I would have, I was, still very much in a state of I'm a victim and
Yeah.
everything is hopeless. And I think it's okay to be there for a little bit, but not forever. But as soon as I started, kind of, I don't know, taking a bit of control, I guess, or feeling like I needed to, being able to sort of collect all these experts in my network to help me, I sort of created this little army of people to assist me who all have different areas of expertise. So you mentioned obviously the doula and my therapist. I think another one was the bereavement midwife who was assigned to
Yes.
us at the hospital. I mean, we didn't have a choice about who that was. And so I think we maybe just got quite lucky because she's turned out to be a huge source of support, even, almost 11 months on, we're
Yeah.
still in touch. And I don't know if that's ordinary for her or not, but She's been amazing. Any question I have about quite literally anything, she is just an email or a phone call away, which has been, it's just nice to have a person like that in your life. I also investigated quite a few support groups for
Mhm.
baby loss,
Mhm.
which due to COVID, any of the in-person support groups were canceled. So again, much like my therapy, I was skeptical that the digital version would do the trick.
Yeah.
Um, but I think I was pleasantly surprised to find, at least in the early days, there's a baby loss charity called SANS
Mhm.
that held a monthly meeting on Zoom that I joined for the first couple of months after George's death. And they were hugely helpful because I think it's run by people, mostly women, who have lost babies, but they're many, many years on from that loss. Many have gone on to have at least one or several other children.
Mhm.
The one woman who led most of the calls lost a baby, something like 22 years ago. So I mean, she's quite a long way on that journey.
Yeah.
And I think I found speaking to those people extremely helpful and hopeful.
Mm.
Because I think what I found with some of the online forums and Facebook pages was
Mhm.
that it's too many people who are in the midst of their own grief, people who have lost babies, yesterday or a week ago or a month ago. And it was just stories of tragedy after tragedy after tragedy. And while there is some, sort of camaraderie in that, and it's an element where you sort of don't feel as alone, it also fuels your anxiety because it feels like this happens all the time.
Yeah.
And it's like I suddenly know 1,000 ways a baby can die. I thought, this was a rare occurrence, and it's like every possible disaster that could happen has happened. And I don't think that those forums had anything to offer me because it's not anyone supporting each other. It's just everyone talking about their own grief. And so for me, the best thing was the groups where people were much further on in that journey
Yeah.
and could talk to me from a more hopeful future place.
Mhm.
And in doing that, I eventually connected with one of the women from the charity who lives nearby, who lost a baby boy in a similar situation to George, but 8 years ago. And she's gone on to have two boys since then. And we've gone for walks and we talk on WhatsApp. And I ask her lots of questions about, what did you do about this? And when this happened, how did you react? And, I know there's no rule book for how to deal with the death of your child, but I think to just have somebody who when they say, I get it, that they really sincerely do, to tell you what they did, I think has been a huge source of comfort.
That is great. I have found that we've gravitated towards the people that are a little farther out, especially at the very beginning, because you're like, I just don't think I'm gonna be okay, and you look okay. Like, it's like you look okay. Okay, we might be able to do this. So
I think that was it. It's like you seem like a normal functioning
yeah.
human who has, two healthy kids, and you're still sad about your baby, and I see that because
Mhm.
I met this particular woman. The place where we decided to meet the first time was at her son's memorial tree.
Oh,
So we looked at it, and she's a runner, so she ran there. I ran there. We met. Well, it was all very just felt very appropriate. And yeah, and I think I get quite prickled when people say comments to me like, "Oh, I know how you feel." It's like
Mm,
I, you may have an idea of what grief is like, but you don't know how this particular thing feels, unless you are, of course, this woman who I've connected with, who has very much been in my situation. When she says stuff like that, I think you do actually know,
yeah,
and I believe you.
yeah,
And you've come out the other side and seem to be a functioning, contributing member of society who actually appears happy, and I find that quite hopeful.
yeah. Yes, it is very hopeful, and we need that at the very beginning. I think we need that.
Definitely.
And you were a very big runner, a very big you were in the fitness industry, and it sounded like the running had kind of pittered off for you for a while there. Wh-
It did. I think I have a very complicated relationship with exercise these days. When I was pregnant with George, I had a real chip on my shoulder, I think, about not letting the pregnancy impact my very sort of rigid and high intensity fitness
Mhm.
routine for as long as possible. I wasn't determined to do anything unsafe, of course, but I was very adamant that I was going to continue being as fit and active as I could be and maintaining that same level of activity for as long as I felt I could. I ran a half marathon when I was 6 weeks pregnant. I continued going to Orange Theory,
Mhm.
classes until I was they shut because of COVID, but until I was 20 weeks pregnant. In hindsight, I think those things were too much. And there's an element of me that believes that that level of intensity, especially in the early days, contributed to George's death. I know practically that that's not true. I've asked multiple medical professionals if excessive exercise can cause what caused his death, which was growth restriction, and they all say no. That that wouldn't have been the cause at all.
Mhm.
Even when I wanted to run that half marathon, I remember asking my GP if it was okay, and the rule of thumb was essentially that if you were fit before and you were training for this before you got pregnant, and you feel okay, carry on. But I think I know in my heart there were many, many times where I pushed it when I didn't feel okay,
Oh, okay.
because I think I felt like I had a point to prove, and so after everything, I think there was a period where I was almost sort of using exercise to punish myself a little bit, like
Mhm.
forcing myself to try and get back into this fitness routine, both because I needed to get back to where I was as quickly as possible, but also because I think my body was a reminder of loss. I think all through pregnancy, people tell you, and they certainly told me that when you are pregnant, that all the changes to your body is worth it. That yes, you might gain weight and you'll be a little softer, and you might not be physically where you were, but it'll all be worth it. And I think that's really only true if you get to take your baby home with you. Because when you don't, your body is just a reminder of how much it failed you and how it just catastrophically let you down. And I hated myself for it. I hated it. I hated looking at myself. Every time I did, it was just a reminder of how I failed. And so I started exercising a lot to try and just get back to where I was, so I didn't have to constantly remind myself every time I looked in the mirror.
Yeah.
I think I'm past that in a much healthier place now, but running is still hard for me because I mean it's a high intensity activity, and I just never kind of fell in love with it again. I'm not as possessed by it as I once was,
Mhm.
and it's hard too because it was such a big part of my identity. I ran because I was a runner. It's who I was, and when you don't do that anymore, it's really who are you? So I'm reevaluating. I'm trying to find different ways of staying active that are more about feeling good and feeling healthy than they are about sort of, beasting myself in the gym,
Mhm.
which I think was perhaps maybe where I was bordering on before was just like it was always like harder, faster, heavier, always. Otherwise it wasn't good enough. It was a waste of time. And I think I really need to reframe that, sometimes actually just like a walk outside is fine.
Yeah.
That's
And
also exercise.
yeah,
You don't
and
need to be dripping and sweating on the verge of vomiting for it to count. So it's hard work. This is a hard area of my life, and it probably sounds trivial to some people who might be listening to this compared to everything else, but it's I'm reworking my relationship with it.
yeah. I understand where you're coming from just because, like, when you do feel like well, there's a couple things. When you feel like your body has betrayed you and taking care of your child, right? Like, that in itself is, one issue that I've dealt with myself, and then the other issue is that, there was the winter before and then there's the winter after, right? Like it's the Miranda before and the Miranda after. And it feels like now that I feel like that I'm a new person. Like I'm a different person. Something's
Yeah.
different about me because of my this little event little big event that happened in my life. And I don't know if I always feel like can I go back to that person that was kind of innocent and did all these things. There's like associations with that old self that sometimes are like, oh, that's not who I am anymore. So just
I
interesting.
I I understand that. I feel like I often now divide my life into, before George and
Hmm.
after. I look at photos sometimes of myself from several years ago, and I think, I don't even know that person.
Yeah.
Who is that?
Yeah.
Like, and sometimes that makes me really sad. I get quite nostalgic, for that sort of easy ignorance that I kind of lived my life with. This very privileged life where I'd never experienced really anything that bad. and just assumed that I never would. Um, and it's hard now. It's hard now to imagine a life where part of my identity maybe doesn't include the word runner, and instead it includes the words bereaved parent. That's not really what I wanted to add
Yeah.
to the list of words that describe me, but it's part of my identity now. So it's a work in progress.
Yeah. We all are works in progress, and yeah, it's frustrating when you're like,
Mm.
"Oh, this is not what I planned it to be," or "This is not what I envisioned my life to be like," and so but we is this happens, and it is what it is. I know that, it sounds like Graham has been a huge support to you, and I'm wondering if you saw a difference between how you guys grieved the loss of George, in this last year.
Yeah, definitely. I think, well, I mean, anyone that has 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 been through this or has done any research or looked up anything related to grief. I mean, I think it's very common understanding that men and women grieve very differently. My firsthand experience is that that is extremely true.
Yeah.
I think in the early days, Graham basically fell into kind of autopilot mode.
Mhm.
He realized that I couldn't handle basically anything, and he took it on himself to manage all of the practicalities and the administrative stuff around George's death. I think people, I think, often don't realize that there is actually kind of a lot of admin associated with the death of someone.
Mhm.
You have to register the death with the council, and you've got to, fill out all this paperwork. And on the more personal side, there was loads of family members that had to be informed and communicated with, and they knew not to contact me because Graham told them not to, and also my phone was off for weeks.
Yeah.
But I think it was quite troubling for people to not be able to see or speak to me in those early days, or at least I've heard from others that they were quite because I just disappeared. They didn't know how I was, and so Graham took on the role of chief communications officer.
Mm.
He managed every incoming communication from family and friends, regardless of what the questions were, and it was a full time job. It was a lot of work.
Yeah.
He shielded me from a lot of stuff. Um, I mean, and terribly around the same time, many of our close friends were also expecting babies,
Mm.
and he very carefully kind of managed the details around that. Making sure that I wouldn't see anything or hear anything as much as he could. It still happened, of course, but trying his best or trying to do it in the most sensitive way possible. And I think when the bulk of that was done, which arguably took many, many months,
Mhm.
I think it was only then that he started realizing that he hadn't really actually processed anything around George's death. um, he started, he had nightmares. It was very unusual for him. His job was quite stressful at the time, and I think he was a bit burnt out. But he's a problem solver, and he's extremely resourceful, and so I think he recognized, that this was a problem, and also is self aware enough to know that he needed something, he needed help of some kind, and
Mhm.
so he also found a therapist who he worked with. Certainly not as long as I've been, but for I think of 6 weeks or so of sessions, and I think he found that really useful.
That's good.
And I think in all of it, I think we just stayed really close in terms of communicating with each other, which I know is quite hard for some couples. Maybe if communication wasn't the strong point in the relationship before, throwing a crisis into the mix doesn't usually help.
Yeah.
So I'm very grateful that we were probably already decent communicators in the first
Mhm.
place. I think that helped. He's also just relentlessly optimistic, like to a ridiculous point where sometimes I'm like, I just want you to say things suck. Like, why can't you just agree for 5 seconds? He's constantly looking on the bright side, and sometimes it's infuriating when you feel like the world is just closing in on you, and you just want somebody to just sit with you and just tell you, like, yes, it is all bad. But most times it was what I needed to hear, and he never gave up on me. I think it would have been really easy to give up on me because I wasn't a good version of myself for a long time. And he just, I don't know, he just kept on being supportive and his amazingly optimistic self. And he was always positive for our future, which I think helped both him and I.
Yeah.
And he's also passionate about sort of self development as well. And I think, encouraging, us to do things together, like, like meditate or do, self improvement,
Mhm.
online courses or, stuff that we could do together like that, where that was both good for him and good for me. So, I think, if I could summarize it, it's probably that, his grieving process was very kind of practical, very,
Yeah.
there is a problem and I will solve it.
Yeah.
And I think that's very ordinary, or common, I should say, for men to assume that role.
Mhm.
I think from what I read and what I hear, it sounds like lots of men do that, but that it does often mean that they don't process their emotions and they do bubble up down the road. That may still happen, and I think he's very aware that that may still happen.
Mhm.
But my hope is that if it does, I will be in a place where I can support him,
Yeah.
because I owe him big time.
Yeah. We all owe our spouses like big time. Yeah, exactly. He sounds you guys sound like you have done very well trying to stick close together and to support each other when the other person may be not at their best. So that's
Yeah. I hope
lucky.
so. I think if there's any silver lining of anything, I think that it's our relationship has remained good. It's certainly not been without its challenges,
Mhm. For
but
sure.
I know that in lots of situations where a baby's died, it often brings couples to end their relationship, and that's just another layer of tragedy on top of an already very trying situation. And I'm very thankful that that wasn't the case for us.
Yeah.
I sincerely don't know how I could have managed if things went a different way.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to jump over and just talk about anything that you do specifically to remember George? I know you have your office that is kind of a space that you get to remember him, and his remains are there as well. Are there any other physical things that you have that remind you of him, or you try to bring into your life so that you're reminded of him?
There are lots of things. I think I'm quite like a sentimental person. I
Mm,
like
mhm.
physical things to sort of look at or like touch and feel. And I think, in the absence of a lifetime of memories with a person, it's really hard to do that for a baby that you didn't get a chance to get to know. But one of the big things, and I was very convinced by this very early on that I wanted it. We had a memorial bench installed
Oh,
on the river outside our house in London, which is a sort of kilometer long, maybe mile long river. And I spent endless hours walking on that river when I was pregnant. I imagined one day walking on it with George and, feeding ducks with him and, spending sunny summer days sitting in the grass and, have really fond memories of walking there. And I always look at the memorial benches that are already there. I like reading them and thinking of
mhm,
the people that have died and that they're remembered. And so I thought, well, we have to get a bench for George because I think having him cremated means we don't have a gravestone or somewhere to go and sort of
right.
visit.
Mhm,
And so the bench now becomes that place for me where if I'm feeling like I want to go and be with him, I can sit on his bench and think of him. Maybe fortunately or unfortunately, I picked what I perceive to be the best spot on the river for the bench. So the bench is almost always occupied,
oh, of course.
especially when it's sunny. So every time I think I'm going to go sit on George's bench, there's usually someone there. But that also puts a smile on my face because
Yeah.
it means that somebody's read his name and they're thinking of him. Next to his bench, we also had a tree planted
Mhm,
because I really liked the idea that if he can't grow big and strong, then the tree can for him.
mhm.
The tree is a maple tree, which is sort of a Canadian, nod to his
Right.
Canadian parents. And yeah, and it just sort of, I think it's just a nice sort of thing. Every time I leave the flat, and I can see it there. And I think people often said, if you move away from London, will you be sad? And I just thought no, because I think it's this thing that will stay there forever, and anyone
Yeah.
that passes by will see this beautiful tree with this beautiful bench, and they'll read his name and they'll think of him. And in terms of keeping his memory alive, I think that felt very important to me. So it took a long time and many emails with the with the local council to get that sorted, but it was finally installed in November of last
Oh,
year. So
wonderful.
not the best time in London for an outdoor bench. It was basically a mud pit for 3 months. Never mind.
But it's been done, so I think
It's been
that's
done.
so sweet. I
Yeah,
yeah. Any other things
I
that
think
you wanna share?
A few other things. I don't know if any of my friends or family will listen to this, so this might come as a surprise to them. But both Graham and I got tattoos to remember George.
Surprise, everybody.
Um, yeah, which we didn't tell anyone. I mean, they're not
No, no, no. Yeah.
overtly, sort of crazy full back tattoos.
Yeah.
Mine is on my wrist. It's just a little lowercase letter G, where the tail loops up into a heart that looks like a balloon.
Oh.
And Graham's is the same. It's just on his forearm instead of his wrist. And I don't know. I look at it all the time, and sometimes like the sleeve of my shirt just shows a little balloon like poking out, and
Oh.
I don't know. Every time I look at it, it just makes me think of him. And the little G was because, well, we were sometimes referring to him as little G. That Graham was the big G, and George was the little
Oh,
G.
that's so sweet.
Um, and it's small and it's subtle, and for me, it was important because I wanted something visible on my body that people might ask me about,
Uh-huh.
because then it gives me a reason to talk about him
Yeah,
again,
yeah.
especially to people who may not have ever even known he existed. Um, and this was something we came up with in the days, in early June following his death, and we
Mhm.
were both very convinced that we would do this as soon, well, again, as soon as COVID allowed tattoo parlors to open
Right.
again. So we snuck in there in November just in time before they shut for 5 months.
Oh, yeah.
But I mean, the tattoo is so simple. It took all of about 30 seconds to put on my body.
Perfect.
It's and I mean, for anyone that knows me, I was very not opposed to tattoos, but I was very much the person that was never ever going to get one. I could never possibly think of anything important enough to put on my body forever. This seemed like the thing.
The most, yeah, important enough there. So I wanna go into this is one of my favorite parts of, this part of the interview is that I like to know what people have, um, done and said that were so helpful to you, that you're like, if you're gonna say something to somebody that has lost a baby, then this is something that you might wanna consider. Let's just talk about some of those things that people did or said that were you
Sure.
felt extremely helpful for you.
Yeah, sure. I think, and I said this to friends and family at the beginning because one of the things they often said was, what can we do? They
Yeah.
wanted us to come up with the things that they could do to support us, and that was really hard because we had no idea, and we didn't have any idea for a long, long time. But I think the things that helped the most was just to check in with us
Mhm.
regularly, and instead of asking, let me know what I can do to help you, the people that said things like, I'm going to call you on Tuesday next week and check in with you, or let's have a call every Thursday morning and just chat. That was so, I know it sounds like the simplest thing on earth, but having someone else make the executive decision on that was helpful at a time where I was incapable of basically even feeding myself. And the other thing was is that there was an appointment to keep me accountable for. It was something to
Yeah.
look forward to when everything else in my life had evaporated. Because the worst thing was feeling like everyone had forgotten about us, or that they'd sent their obligatory "I'm so sorry" message and disappeared. The people that stayed close and connected to us long after the initial days and weeks following George's death were invaluable to me, and they didn't have to do much. I mean, I think there was this real sort of sense with people that they had to say the perfect thing or
Mhm.
say something that takes away the pain. And it's a fool's errand because it's impossible.
Yes.
There was nothing that could have made me feel better. But the single best thing people did was to to check in. And when they asked how I was, and I said I was terrible, to just be okay with listening to how terrible I really was,
Yeah.
and not try to sugarcoat it or make it sound better or look for a silver lining or, you know, I don't know, try to just take away that pain, just to allow me to be sad. Um, I think that was really nice. On a more practical side, I think some people sent food, which I think can be really nice. But I think I think I said this to you before. There's only so many frozen lasagnas that a girl can eat. Um, it was very helpful to have things kind of at the ready that we could
Yes.
make, especially in the early days when I couldn't cook anything, and I didn't want obviously the lion's share of the work to fall to Graham. That was helpful. I would just say maybe check in with the rest of your friends and family and make sure you're not overloading the poor person with food.
Yeah.
um, and I think the other thing was when people actually asked me about George, people were so afraid to talk about him, to even say his name. And for the very brave friends and family that tried, I'm really thankful to them because one thing I think people don't necessarily realize is that the mother of the baby that's died still had a baby,
Yeah.
and I think there was a part of me that still really wanted to talk about him. And nobody asks you all the normal questions they ask somebody when they've had a baby. Nobody asked me what the birth was like or why we picked the name we did. And for the few people that did bravely venture into that territory, I will be forever thankful for them. I think for anyone listening, if you're worried about asking those questions to a friend or family member that's lost a baby, maybe just start by asking if it's okay if you ask a question. Some people said things like, "Is it okay if I ask you about George?" Or "Would you like to tell me about George's birth?" And I think being able to make that decision myself and
Yeah.
either say, "Yes, I do want to tell you about this," or "No, I don't," was really helpful. It was certainly much more helpful than people just saying, "I'm so sorry and I can't imagine how you feel. Bye." And, good luck with your grief. I'll talk to you when you're better.
Right. Yeah, that
Which, and I don't mean to, sorry, I don't mean to trivialize those sorts of messages. I think people, they were doing the best they could
mhm.
with the words they had available to them. I definitely don't expect people to know the right thing to say is really hard. I wouldn't have known the right thing to say to me either. In fact, I probably would have used a lot of those phrases for lack of even any experience with grief myself before George's death. But I think if I could say anything that was helpful is just to not be afraid to mention the baby's name, and to allow the family to speak about that baby without being visibly uncomfortable or trying to shut it down because it's too sad.
Yeah. We just wanna talk about our kids, right? I think that
Of
is
course.
it's so like, and there's a sense of pride of being able to say that I birthed my child. That is, like, a big deal, and you're right, people don't ask about the details. I remember, a good friend of mine, she was dropping off some food after we lost our son, and she's like, "Can I ask you a question? Can you tell me about the birth?" And I was like, "Yeah, yeah, I wanna talk about that because
Yeah.
it's a big it's in itself a big accomplishment to have given
I
birth, and it was your first
I
time
think
too, you know?"
exactly, exactly. And I think people don't know if they should because they're so afraid of upsetting
Mhm.
the grieving person. And I get that, I do. Because the worst thing someone would feel is if they just caused you more pain and upset you more. But I think, and I don't want to speak for everyone, but I think for me, the thing that was most painful was feeling like I couldn't talk about it,
Yeah.
was having to pretend that George never existed because it was too uncomfortable for other people. And that just is another layer of just insult to injury with the loss of a baby, is that not only are you grieving and going through shock and dealing with this tremendous tragedy, you feel like you have to do it alone because it's too horrifying for anyone else to engage with.
Yeah.
And I think for those brave friends that allowed me to talk to them about something that was truly their worst nightmare, I will be very thankful to them forever because, those moments were really important to me.
Yeah.
And for the ones that just asked me the normal questions about, you know, giving birth and having a baby and didn't make me feel like I was invalidated from being a mom, I think,
Hmm.
that's really important.
Yeah, that is so, so important. I wanna bring up one thing that you mentioned. We've talked about, your friend before, and she was the one that actually referred you to us, and I you said something about what she did, and I want you to repeat it again because I think that it was really great. She did something that was, like, kind of out of the ordinary, right? She found a podcast and said, "Hey, I'm just trying to understand where you're coming from." And she,
Yeah.
did something that was a little different. I'm not saying, like, join our community if you want to, but she did something that was, she was just trying to understand what you were experiencing, and that is huge, I
Yeah.
think.
I think I had a couple friends who I think displayed a extremely evolved level of emotional
Mhm.
intelligence in that fact, sort of realizing that they have no idea about what I might be going through. And in an effort to try and help me, found podcasts like yours or read books
Mhm.
about baby loss so that they were better equipped to have those conversations. Um, I mean, that to me is kind of a next level of grief support that I wouldn't expect most people are capable of doing. But this particular friend, yeah, found was basically looking for ways to understand something that she had no ability to understand, or no sort of anything in her life that was similar. And I think, for that reason, she was able to just so much more easily talk to me about things because she suddenly realized what was okay to ask and not ask, or just felt a bit empowered to be able to even talk to me at all. And I think, her and her husband were hugely supportive in the early days, and just making sure that they mentioned George, remembered his milestone,
Mhm.
every second of the month, sending a message saying they were thinking of him, lighting a candle for him. I mean, people don't have to do that. That's above and beyond. But for the ones that did, it meant the world to me.
Yeah. I think that I just think, "Oh, you're so lucky to have good friends," like yeah. It's wonderful having
I
those good
think
friends.
it was, I mean, in the absence of also being able to see anyone in person because of the lockdown, which was seemingly endless.
Yeah.
Um, that was also a huge help because I think it was very easy to be in grief, to isolate yourself, and it's obviously very easy to isolate yourself in a lockdown. And I think quite easy to be forgotten in the midst of, everyone else is struggling and suffering
Right.
too, to a degree.
Completely.
I think it's easy to get caught up in your own world as well. And so for those that kind of put their own troubles aside and, remember to send me a text message, or took the time to listen to a podcast or read a book, I mean, I really, I can't say enough about how much that meant to me. So I think, if people are listening and it's something you feel capable of doing, I really would encourage it. As hard as it is, this is a hard topic. It's heavy. It's not easy.
Yeah.
But if you can do that and allow and educate yourself to be better for your friend or your family, they will notice.
Yes. They will notice, yes, there's so few people that do that above and beyond those things, so and on the flip side, are there some things that you would probably recommend not saying and or doing that were maybe that grated on you or kinda made you mad or anything like that? Because those are the things that I think people wanna try and avoid.
Sure.
Um, yeah, let's hear what and anything that in particular that
There are a few things, and I think I may offer subtle adjustments to
Oh,
those
okay,
things
okay, yes, let's hear. We
that
always like
that
those.
will help people. So, and I mentioned this before, but I think one of the most common phrases that we heard, which was the sign off to virtually every text message and email that we received, was "Let me know if there's anything I can do to help." I hate that phrase.
Yeah.
I know that phrase comes from a place of good. And please, if any friends and family are listening and you said this to me, this is not me, saying you did the wrong thing. But I think it was impossible for me to ever let you know what you could do to help because A, I had no idea,
Mhm.
and B, even if I had the capacity to come up with something, I already felt so vulnerable already. The last thing I was going to do was to reach out to somebody and say, "Please, can you do this for me?"
Right.
I just simply wouldn't have done it. And I think for the friends and family who instead just took the executive decision and said, "Hey, I'm going to do this thing. You tell me if this is helpful or not," exponentially more helpful. So even small things like, "I'm going to call you next Tuesday,"
Yes.
or "We're going to send you a food bundle that's going to arrive on this day," or, "We've, I don't know, booked you an appointment for something at this place."
Mhm.
It doesn't really matter what it is. Obviously, it depends on the person that you're speaking to. I mean, you would know your grieving person best, but I think allow them to tell you yes or no instead of putting the onus on them to come up with the solution for you.
Yes.
Um, that was hard for me
Yeah.
because it felt like sort of a throwaway comment where it was just like, all right, well, I've put the offer out there, and if I don't
Yeah.
hear from them, I guess I don't need to do anything now. And in a lot of situations, that was the last I ever heard from people.
Mhm.
And again, this is not to to say that they've done the wrong thing, but I think for those that tried, and just, made an effort to come up with a solution was a lot more helpful in the early days. I think
Yes.
now I'm much better at saying, what it is I want or don't want, but that's only with the benefit of, 11 months of even understanding my own triggers and my own my own heart, really. So I think that's one thing.
Yes.
Um, the other one that this is quite a sensitive one, but one of the things that happened really frequently and continues to happen is a lot of friends or women in my network shared stories of their own loss, mostly early, maybe early or late miscarriages,
Mhm.
or something like that. And I think on the one hand, I think I know that people share those stories as a way to relate and, try to help me feel less alone, to show that they have some experience with loss in a way. But I think I would just caution people to be a bit careful about the way they share those stories with somebody who's experienced a stillbirth. I might suggest instead that you ask if they want to hear about your story first before you just unload your story on them.
Mhm.
For example, say, would it be okay if I told you about my own baby loss story? Or would you like to hear about my experience with miscarriage? Because I think there was a time where I did want to hear those stories and I was receptive to them. But there was also a lot of time where I definitely was not. And to be blindsided with those stories is just a message in your inbox or a Facebook Messenger message from someone that I hadn't spoken to in many years.
Mhm.
It's tough because then I feel like I need to then offer empathy and support when
Mm.
I don't have a lot to give right now on
Yeah.
that front, and equally I don't have any experience with miscarriage, so I don't want to pretend like my situation is the same. Similar to the way I would hope that they wouldn't necessarily think that theirs is the same. Comments that really prickled me were when people had experienced an early miscarriage who said things like, "I know exactly how you feel," or "I've been there." And I thought to myself, "You haven't been there at all. This is not the same thing at all." And while there are elements of shared grief, there are some similarities in that story or our stories. I often try to use the analogy sometimes with people that it's like telling someone in a wheelchair that you understand what it's like to be paralyzed because you broke your leg once. Like, you might understand what it's like to be inconvenienced by crutches, but you most certainly don't know what it's like to be paralyzed.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a crude analogy, but I feel like it's similar in a way, in that any loss, of course, is tragic, and there are similarities in the grief that accompany it. But I think I would just caution women who have experienced a miscarriage to just tread a bit carefully when you share those stories with someone who's had a late term loss, because the experiences are quite different.
Yeah.
So just to maybe ask first if they want to hear that story.
Yes. Yeah. That is that's a good way to do it. And just letting people know.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. Sorry, I think that was all I wanted to say on that.
Okay, perfect. Any other it sounds like keep going. Let's hear some more things that you would
Sorry,
prefer.
I do know one other thing. The last thing was I think phrases along the lines of, this happened for a reason, or it was God's will, or you will realize down the road why this happened, or it'll make you a better person, or any comment that seemed to suggest that there was a reason why George died, some grand design by the
Mhm.
universe, really rattled me.
Yeah.
um, it rattled me because it made me feel like if I don't change my life radically or do something grand, like, I don't know, devote my life to placenta research or open the wing of a hospital and name it after George, that I've somehow missed the point of his death. And I suddenly felt this enormous pressure to do something grand, that if I wasn't, then I was messing this up somehow. This notion that there's this God that's just sort of doling out, punishment like this it's just not a helpful thing to say. And even though that may be your belief, and that's perfectly within your right to have it, I think those comments might be better kept to yourself. And there's no doubt that having a stillbirth or any sort of loss changes you in a way, and lots of people's lives do change quite dramatically as a result. But that's a symptom. That's an outcome. That's that wasn't a strategy by the universe.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
um, so I think I would just basically eliminate those phrases from anything. Just get rid of them. They're just not helpful.
They are not helpful at all, and they just yep, and they just kind of make you feel, the lost parent makes you they just feel worse. Yeah, it's just a lot of pressure.
And I know that again, I do just want to say that I know that all of these things come from a place of good. Anyone that said things like this to me, I didn't get mad. And
No,
I'm not
no.
mad. I just think there are in hindsight and with the benefit of experience and time to reflect on this, there are different things that would have been more helpful. And so I think if this helps someone say better things to someone who is grieving in the future, that makes me feel like George's life had impact.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much, Miranda. This has been such a enlightening conversation. I would like to ask you though one last thing. Is there anything that any last bit of advice that you would want to give to lost moms, lost dads, and maybe those who are supporting them or helping them?
I think for those that are supporting them, I think one thing I just like to leave people with is to just, if you can, try to get a bit comfortable with sadness. I know that sounds
Hmm.
weird, but we have this sort of cultural notion that sadness is bad, and that we have to make it go away. And if there's a sad person, we have to get away because it's like it's contagious or something. But all that really does is make the grieving person feel more lonely
Yeah.
and feel like you have to just grieve in silence. And all of these things happen in your mind while you're alone and you feel like you can't talk to anyone about it. And then there's a period of time that goes by where we've decided that's the prerequisite time in which a grieving person can be grieving. But after that, we then close the door on that and you're normal and you're fine and we never speak of it again. And honestly, I think that is one of the most damaging ways to treat grief. As a society, as a
Mhm.
human race, we have to get better at this because everyone is going to experience some kind of loss in their life. No, it's not going to be, the loss of a baby, but a parent or grandparent or close friend. I mean, and there are similarities in that grief. And broadly, I would say we are terrible at
Yes.
supporting people.
Mhm.
So I don't think you need to say the right thing or be obsessed about saying the right thing. You don't even really need to say anything. I think it's just to be okay being sad with
Yeah.
that person and just allowing them to be sad in your presence and not shy away from that the way that we so routinely do, because it's uncomfortable. Because that is the best thing you can do is
Mm.
to really just sit in the sad with them.
Yeah. It's so
um,
comforting, yeah, when somebody's okay just being there with you.
yeah, and I mean, for parents, I mean, I don't know that I have any nuggets of wisdom necessarily. I still feel like I'm early in this journey myself, but I think, the thing that everyone tells you in the beginning is that even though it doesn't feel possible, things will get better. And I know that if you're listening to this and you're in the early stages, you probably don't believe that. And or maybe you do, but you think it's an impossibly long future ahead or time ahead. But it is true. I mean, time does help. It never goes away. I think that's maybe the thing is that you don't get over grief
Mhm.
or even get through it. I think you just find ways to live alongside it. And I think, maybe that's a grim prospect, but my hope is that, that I can think of George and remember him without that sort of, kind of searing pain that's accompanied so much of this because yeah, I think his life had major impact and not just on me but I think people who know us and know of him and so to keep his memory alive and that feels important.
Thank you so much, Miranda. This was so good to hear from you and to hear your words of advice because they were helpful to me too. But thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me.